We all have a tendency to read the Bible in and out of our own context, but the text really comes alive for us when we read the Bible with an understanding of the context that the original audience lived in. What was the Bible trying to say to those people who first heard and read these words? And a good example of this comes from the early chapters of Exodus. We're all familiar with the story of baby Moses being handed over into the Nile. Exodus chapter 1 sets up the story where the Israelite population is increasing and it is threatening the Egyptians. And so Pharaoh decides to commit infanticide. And when he cannot enlist the help of the midwives, he passes a decree that we discover at the end of chapter 1. Exodus 1 verse 22, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people, every Hebrew boy that is born must be thrown into the Nile. Now, the thing that we often miss is the fact that Israel and the Egyptians were living in a polytheistic culture. That means that many gods were worshipped. In fact, Egypt was probably the most polytheistic culture in the ancient world. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of Egyptian deities. And one of the primary deities worshipped by the Egyptians was the Nile River god, often depicted as a god named Hapi. And this god controlled the flooding of the Nile, which was critical to Egyptian agriculture. Their national identity revolved around this annual flooding of the Nile, which allowed for crops to grow and the carrying of silt down to create a vast fertile plain. So Hapi, the Nile River deity, was one of the most significant Egyptian deities. So when Pharaoh orders that all the baby Hebrew boys be thrown into the Nile, he's not just committing them to death by drowning. He is handing them over to one of the primary deities that the Egyptians worship. So when we read in Exodus chapter 2 that Moses is put into a basket, and interestingly, that word for basket, which is mentioned in Exodus chapter 2, verse 3, a papyrus basket. The Hebrew word there could also just as easily be translated ark. It's the same word that we read in the story of the flood in Genesis chapter 6, verse 14. So Noah was essentially put into an ark, a rudderless boat. And the fact that it has no rudder means that obviously Moses is not guiding this boat. But behind the scenes at work is not the Nile River deity, but Yahweh, the one true God, whom the Israelites will come to know by name in the book of Exodus. And this is the first place where we see Yahweh revealed in the text. So what we really get in this narrative is not just the story of a baby boy being thrown into a river in the hopes that he might drown. This is really a story about a conflict between the one true God, Yahweh, who Israel is being called to worship, and the false gods that the Egyptians worshipped. In this case, one of their most powerful deities, Hapi, the Nile River deity. So that when baby Moses is rescued from the Nile, this story demonstrates the superiority of Yahweh over these other supposed deities. Now, we miss the power of this narrative because we don't live in a polytheistic culture, at least in the sense that we worship other deities. We don't have idols. There are certainly things that we make idols, whether that might be success or money or popularity or whatever it might be, our own comfort, nationalism, any of those things can become idols. But we don't typically worship lots of other deities. We're not really a polytheistic culture, but the ancient world was. And so this narrative spoke loudly to the Israelites who had lived in that polytheistic culture for 400 years. And as far as we know from the biblical witness, God never sent any prophets or performed any miracles during that 400-year period when Israel was immersed in this polytheistic culture. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't speak, and it doesn't mean that he wasn't present, but if he was, we don't know about it from the biblical record. And so to the Israelites, it may have seemed that their God, the God of their ancestor Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, was a distant, silent God. And they were surrounded by a culture that embraced many gods who were thought to be active. This narrative speaks directly into that context. And for the original readers, this would be a challenge to the Israelites to abandon the culture that they had been immersed in for years and years and years. To abandon this idea that there are many gods and those gods are powerful, and to embrace a devotion to the one true God, Yahweh. That's the power of that story in Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2. That a baby is put into a rudderless ark, but guided by the hand of Yahweh through the Nile, which was thought to be controlled by Hapi, the Nile River deity. And this child was delivered and saved so that he might grow up to be a savior for the people of Israel. And this young boy will grow up to be Moses, the prophet, the judge, the leader of Israel. And his primary task was not so much to get Israel out of Egypt, but to get Egypt out of Israel. And this story of baby Moses' rescue called Israel to abandon that Egyptian way of viewing the world, polytheistic view that embraced the worship of many gods, so that Israel might worship the one true God. And this is a good example of how context helps us understand a book like Exodus and brings the text alive.